Last week, as we considered the New Deal and the NRA, we, like people at the time, considered whether the programs of FDR did too much or too little to solve the crises arising from the Great Depression. I presented you with videos of critics of FDR. You should always try to think of the larger contexts for events like the New Deal. Imagine the events from the perspective of that time, rather than the comforting knowledge of how things turned out. There were other ideas about solving the problems of the Depression out there, and events might have turned out very differently. Events did turn out differently for other democracies confronting the worldwide economic depression of the 1930s. Back in 1917, when Woodrow Wilson had declared that, quote, the world must be made safe for democracy, that's not what happened. At the Versailles Peace Conference in Paris, after what was then the Great War, World War I to us, representative government, whether republic or democracy, became the model for post-war government everywhere in Europe outside of the Soviet Union. From the ruins of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and part of the Tsarist Russian Empire, 9 new democracies came into existence. The Ottoman Empire gave way to the Turkish Republic. Even Germany became a democracy. The transition from monarchy and empire to republics and democracies was not pretty. When the old empires were carved up, the new democratic nations sometimes contained ethnic minorities who thought they had been put in the wrong nation when the maps were redrawn at Versailles. For example, the new nation of Czechoslovakia contained not only Czechs and Slovaks, but a sizable, long-established German population whose status would be trouble for both Czechoslovakia and the world. None of these newly created representative governments were strong enough to deal with the economic crisis of the Great Depression. By the mid-1930s, dictatorship, or something very much like it, had replaced democracy as the model for government throughout much of Europe. Even nations with long-established representative institutions, France and England, heard voices suggesting that democracy was a failed experiment. Even in the United States, with 150 years of representative government, there were doubts. You will recall the videos of characters like Huey Long and Francis Townsend. Along with Father Coughlin, these popular figures not only proposed social experiments much more radical than the New Deal, but they also questioned whether or not the Democratic and Republican parties, or indeed the existing form of government, were up to the task of dealing with the economic crisis. It was not, however, just characters who we might dismiss as crackpots questioning the capacity of representative government. Experienced politicians and journalists of both parties warned FDR that he might, like Mussolini, Stalin, and Hitler, need to assume, at least temporarily, dictatorial powers. Indeed, the most powerful publisher of the time, William Randolph Hearst, personally oversaw the production of a major Hollywood movie, Gabriel over the White House, intended, in the words of one scholar, quote, to instruct FDR and prepare the public for a dictatorship. The hero of the film is a president who shatters constitutional government. He fires his entire cabinet, governs without Congress, creates a personal army from the unemployed, dispenses with civilian courts, and ultimately uses the threat of a superweapon to compel the nations of the world to sign a disarmament treaty. This was not a cautionary tale of what could happen. Hearst wanted this to happen. You should keep in mind that for the people of this time, the very survival of democracy was in doubt. Here is a central scene from the movie.
I speak for the majority of the Senate and the House of Representatives, assured that President Hammond has been a traitor to his party, false to the principles on which he was elected. I propose to demand from the House the impeachment, the immediate removal of the President of the United States. The President of the United States.
May the rules be suspended? I would like to dispense with all red tape so I can answer questions directly while I have the floor.
Unless there is objection, the rules of this Congress will be suspended.
Gentlemen, I am here as a representative of the American people in their hour of darkest despair. A plant cannot be made to grow by watering the top alone and letting the roots go dry. The people of this country are the roots of the nation, and the sturdy trunk and the branches too. You have spent $4 billion only to aggravate adversity. I ask for $4 billion to restore buying power, stimulate purchases, restore prosperity. You have wasted precious days and weeks and years in futile discussion. We need action, immediate and effective action.
Mr. President, there is a movement in Congress for your impeachment. Hardly the time for making any requests, however small.
Very well. I shall withdraw that request, but I would like to substitute another. I ask you, gentlemen, to declare a state of national emergency and to adjourn this Congress until normal conditions are restored. During the period of that adjournment, I shall assume full responsibility for the government.
Mr. President, this is dictatorship.
Senator Langham, words do not frighten me.
But the United States of America is a democracy. We are not yet ready to give up the government of our fathers.
You have given it up. You've turned your backs. You've closed your ears to the appeals of the people. You've been traitors to the concepts of democracy upon which this government was founded. I believe in democracy as Washington, Jefferson, and Lincoln believed in democracy. And if what I plan to do in the name of the people makes me a dictator, then it is a dictatorship based on Jefferson's definition of democracy, a government for the greatest good of the greatest number.
This Congress refuses to adjourn.
I think, gentlemen, you forget that I am still the President of these United States. And as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, it is within the rights of the President to declare the country under martial law.
The crisis of the 1930s came to a head, as you know, with the rise of Hitler to the leadership of Germany shortly after FDR was elected. It is painful to consider that the American isolationism evident in the Neutrality Acts and the America First movement, led by Charles Lindbergh, were cited by Hitler as reasons for his willingness to attack his neighbors. It is frightening to consider that the outcome of the Second World War was much more uncertain than we sometimes like to admit. When the war in Europe began in September 1939, the U.S. began to make military preparations, but it was still determined to stay out of the war. For example, the U.S. began to expand the Army. It needed to. At the time, the U.S. Army was the 19th largest army in the world. Its 175,000-man force was smaller than that of Portugal. Yet FDR only asked for 750,000 men, insisting that there would be no expeditionary force into Europe as there had been during World War I. While not as certain as the strongest advocates of neutrality that the U.S. would be safe behind its ocean bulwarks FDR's administration believed that the combination of French armies, larger even than Germany's armies, British sea power, and American industrial might, especially airplanes for the democracies, would keep the Nazi wolves at bay. By the spring of 1940, the wolves had torn that strategic plan to tatters. The Blitzkrieg of May 1940 that led to the surrender of France removed one prop to American safety, the French army. With Britain under siege and alone, the U.S. feared that the second prop, the British Navy, might be at risk. In May 1940, Winston Churchill, the new Prime Minister, assured FDR that he would never give in, but warned that if the battle for Britain went poorly, other politicians would replace him and, quote, "You must not be blind to the fact that the sole remaining bargaining counter with Germany would be the fleet, and if this country was left by the United States to its fate, no one would have the right to blame those then responsible if they then made the best terms they could for the surviving inhabitants." In other words, in a pinch, the British Navy might be traded away to the Nazis. Churchill was begging for American support, and FDR was inclined to give it, despite the obstacles of the last of a series of neutrality acts that forbade the U.S. from providing credit for purchasing war materiel. However, FDR's advisors and diplomats warned him that the British could not last, that they would surrender, and any aid Roosevelt provided them would be wasted, possibly even falling into German hands. The war was almost over before it started. The circumstances were so dire that previously unthinkable acts were committed to demonstrate to doubters that the British would persevere, that FDR's gamble on their survival was not utterly misplaced. In July 1940, after the French had signed a truce, been partially occupied, and established the Vichy government in the south of France, the British sent ships to Mers el-Kebir, a naval base in French Algeria, where a significant portion of the French fleet was anchored. The British demanded that the French either surrender those vessels or scuttle them. That is, the French must sink the ships themselves. When the French refused, the Royal Navy opened fire on the French fleet that technically was still their ally, and certainly not their enemy. Nearly 1,300 French sailors were killed. Churchill believed that the attack was a turning point. The world, and especially the Americans, were convinced that the British would not sue for peace with Hitler. This desperate measure did not end the immediate crisis. Only Hitler's decision to gamble on invading the Soviet Union a year later, in June 1941, may have prevented the invasion and defeat of Britain. And the Germans came quite close to taking Moscow. World War II was a close-run thing. The outcome was not inevitable.